For some reason, I'm getting the impression that people expect me to cover visual novels these days, which I suppose I'm not entirely opposed to because some of them are sweet! But here we have another one, codenamed XBlaze Code Embryo. Just decided to throw that codename bit in the beginning to fuck with some heads. It's what we have on the menu for today's special. However, before we kick off, I'd like to make a quick list of what counts for a Japanese graphic visual novel these days. On the list we should have A. Anime sprites, B. A bland or weak protagonist that can't react realistically to any given situation, C. Set in a high school, or everyone's a high schooler, D. There's loads of people with superpowers, with the protagonist having the most powerful one of them all. E. The main villain speaks in a monotone voice and appears to not be interested in absolutely anything. F. One of the younger characters will have grey hair. G. All of the girls will have unrealistically massive tits. And finally H. There will be a section of the plot that's dedicated entirely to needless fan service. Right, so does XBlaze tick any of these boxes? Well, let me put it like this. Tick, 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 tick. It hit all of them. Sorry, had to start with something that sounds vaguely like a rant. But I seem to keep going on about good stuff in these rant videos these days instead of, actually ranting. Oh well, here's some good stuff. For a visual novel that seems to be reviewed by most to be quite average, I actually like this one and would rate it slightly higher. There are several elements to it that I was really impressed with that you just don't seem to see anywhere else, and I found the overall story to be somewhat interesting. But before we get to any of the juicy stuff, let's go back to the beginning and talk about the game itself as a whole. For those of you who are unaware, XBlaze X Embryo... Hang on, I screwed up there. It's a visual novel that's set in the BlazBlue universe. It takes place 150 years before the fighting games, and follows the story of Toya Kagari, and apologies in advance if I end up calling him Toya-chan at some point, because it's Japanese dub, English sub. So Toya-chan is a high school student who's honestly quite bland, doesn't have too many friends with the exception of about 2 close friends, and is admittedly also quite the coward. But then one day, he gets attacked by a hobo who tries to kill him by shouting a laser out of his mouth. Apparently this is Skyrim, but is saved at the last second by a mysterious and emotionless girl called S. It turns out that several people in Japan have been infected with a virus that has transformed them into violent beings that make up a part of a collective known as the Union. So the Mitsurugi agency decides to monitor Toya to make sure that he is indeed the keeper of the grimoire, and that his crystal colour doesn't change because otherwise... Sorry, did I lose you there? Okay, so yeah, the plot takes a while to get your head around. Tell you what, let me dumb it down a bit. Toya can sense these Union guys, but might be infected with it as well. So an agency that's trying to fight these guys assigns S to protect him, and then all of a sudden, every female character in the game realises that Toya is a pussy magnet, because awkward teenage boys are just so damned irresistible these days. And they all decide to move into his house, which is actually his friend's house, except for the Sundre girl who's blatantly got the hots for him too. The first third of the game focuses on introducing the setting, introducing the characters, introducing the article and database mechanic, and introducing the villains of the game. The main one, of course, talks in a monotone voice and is interested in absolutely fuck all, and as an added bonus, he has grey hair, or greyish hair. The first third is quite entertaining, as each character is vastly different from one another and complement each other quite well. Unfortunately, however, the plot begins to grind to a halt around the halfway mark. By this point, it kind of feels like the story is saying the following. Yes, we know that some magic users need to be killed. Oh, there's magic in this, by the way. But before we go any further, I've just realised there's been no fan service in this game so far. So here's a chapter dedicated entirely to fan service. Okay, done. Sorry, what was the plot again? Oh yeah, magic people and 10 sages. Is there any chance we can go back to the fan service? Sure, the plot does pick up after that and starts to get interesting again, with multiple endings to reach as well. So there's a reason to play it through more than once, just to see the different endings. And it must be noted that all of these endings vastly differ from one another, so it's entirely possible to play the game again and get a completely different story. Now this leads me neatly onto the toy system, or the information database that you'll be using from time to time. So long as there's not an important scene happening, you can access this database to find out what's been going on in the game's world, such as news articles, or just random shit about how some inconsequential dickhead loves pudding. And there's also a database on all the characters too, which gets updated every time you learn something new about them. However, as the game tells you at the start, This tool is vital for getting certain endings. Actually, I'd like to amend that statement. It's vital for getting any ending. Some scenes will only play out provided that you've read certain articles. The reason being is that there might be a piece of information on one of them that the main character must know before said scene starts. If you haven't read it, then that scene won't play out, and because of this, the story will follow a different path, most of the time leading to a bad ending or a dead end. Now, at first I thought that this was a shit idea. I initially didn't like the fact that I was going to have to put the story on ice because I had to read a bollocks article about some fucking tea shop that sells cake that some random girl on the internet really likes. I was all like, how the fuck is any of this relevant? Why do I have to read all this crap when all I want to do is carry on with the main story? Someone's just about to die, but nope, gotta put that on hold because there's an article about BFF Day. I mean, talk about getting your priorities right. It felt like the true ending or whatever was being held at ransom unless I read a load of extra articles. And I didn't want to waste time reading about stuff because I wanted to carry on with the plot. But then it hit me. If I'm thinking like that, then that makes me one hell of a hypocrite. I'm basically reading a visual novel and complaining about having to do any reading. So what this game's actually doing is not blackmailing you into reading these bits, it's actually using reverse psychology to get you to do it. Which I did. Still didn't enjoy those articles, but hey. So I carried on until I finished the game, and you know what? From starting off thinking that the toy system was crap, I actually ended the game resolved that the toy system was still crap, and here's my reasons why. As I mentioned at the start, the game makes it very clear that you'll need to read certain articles in order to get some form of decent ending. So like anyone would in that situation, I ended up reading every goddamned article. Turns out, however, that to get any of the good endings, you need to read some articles and ignore others. However, the sole condition for unlocking the really crap and abrupt ending is to read every article. What the flying fuck? Do you realise that what this game has done is insist on you reading all of its articles by making it very clear that their system is integral to the plot's progression, and then punishes you for it by giving you a bad ending? God, it feels good to be back! I ended up getting tricked into more pointless reading just to get shafted right at the end. Speaking of reading, I did learn something interesting. Apparently, every time you pirate a game, a puppy gets fed to a wood chipper. Who's the one putting these puppies into wood chippers? Is it the devs? Is this their way of preventing their game from getting pirated? Like they're saying, sure, you can pirate our game, but I'm instructed to inform you that should you go ahead, then I'll have no choice but to put this puppy into a wood chipper. If this is the case, then you have grounds not to buy this game at all. On a positive note though, if you do decide to let the puppies die, then you'll notice the level of detail that's given to the animations in this game. I was really impressed to see each sprite model actually move. Slightly. Blink, move their mouths when they talk, physically react and move in certain places. It's something you don't see as often in visual novels these days, with just static sprite images being used instead, and it made this visual novel feel more like an interactive anime than a novel. In fact, each sprite looks to be a part of the scenery or background image, making one complete image, rather than using layers upon layers of images, which sounds good on paper, but doesn't always translate too well. The best way to describe it is this. What looks better? Drawing an image on a piece of paper, or drawing an image on a piece of paper, cutting it out and then putting it onto another piece of paper? Obviously the first one, and XBlaze has gone for that approach, rather than the second, which most visual novels tend to do these days. All this means is that the finish looks better, so kudos towards the game for that. Though it must be said the lip sync is a little out of sync even for the Japanese voices, but it still stood out as a shining example of how better these novels look when the developers apply some small forms of animation to each character. There is also the odd animated scene as well, which helps to add to the immersion. And though I'm only picking up the odd word or occasional phrase, but the voice acting was pretty good as well. See, with things like this, you're making what we see on the screen more believable, or rather, we're more likely to accept what's going on because things aren't being left to our imagination, nor are we being left to act out the scene in our heads. If you want to use your imagination, then go read a f***ing book. Those things don't have pictures or moving parts. But a visual novel does. Visual novels aren't entirely books, and whilst the focus is still on the reading aspect of it, there's also another word in the name of the genre, and that's visual, and it's nice to see a developer pay particular attention to the visual side of the game. Is the story believable though? Absolutely not. Everyone's a hypocrite, none more so than S, the so-called emotionless girl of the game, whose sole job is to make sure that no harm comes to Toya, yet she will happily stand back and let the angry 15-year-old kick the shit out of him whenever she feels like it. There's the curry house girl, who gives Toya a hard time about being a part-timer, but then does no work of her own around the restaurant. There's the angry girl that I've already mentioned, that calls up the main character to ask for a favour, moans at him about something and then hangs up, without even asking for the favour. And then there's Yuki, who owns the house that the entire cast lives in, who welcomes everyone into her home with open arms and offers them unprecedented hospitality, but then monopolises the food around the dinner table. But with all of these things in mind, you have to remember one thing. No one reads a Japanese visual novel expecting or hoping to find something normal or ordinary. They are by nature supposed to be weird, with bizarre events occurring and characters reacting in totally unnatural ways. That's what makes them so interesting. And it must be said that XBlaze Code Ridiculous and its confusing game title is definitely interesting enough to get you to see it through to the end, and will most certainly amuse and entertain you on some level. If Japanese visual novels are your thing, then I'd say go out and get it. It's available on the PS3 and the Vita, and it's come down a little in price since its release. If the series itself is your thing, then you probably already own it. And finally, if Japanese visual novels aren't your thing, or if you've never heard of True Review before, then chances are you're not even watching this video. Which means I can say anything I want about you. Hey, I hear you like to.
Sometimes I think this life is killing me.